She dropped to her knees in the mud and pressed her father's last letter against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her heart from stopping. Rain hammered the Montana earth around her. The man standing in the doorway above her, tall, scarred, silent as a gravestone, hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Just stared at the broken woman kneeling in the dirt outside his ranch, like she was something the storm had thrown at his feet. "My father said you needed a wife," Abigail Harper whispered through the rain, "and I have nowhere left on this earth to go." Ethan Walker stared at her for a long moment. Something crossed his face, not pity, not irritation. Something older and quieter than either of those things. Then he said, "Come inside." If you are watching this and your heart already aches, you are exactly who this story was made for. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow every part of Ethan and Abigail's journey to the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let us go back to where it all truly began. The letter arrived the same morning the last of Ethan Walker's ranch hands quit. He found it propped against the front door when he came back from the barn, still smelling of hay and cold mud, his boots leaving dark prints across the porch boards. He almost walked past it. Letters rarely brought anything worth reading to a man like him. But he saw the name written on the outside in handwriting he recognized immediately, and he stopped. Samuel Harper. Ethan stood there in the morning cold, and did not open it right away. He just looked at the name, and for a moment, the years folded back on themselves, and he was a younger man again, standing in the office of the Silver Creek Bank, listening to a loan officer explain in flat, efficient language exactly how many days he had before they took his land. He remembered the shame of it, the particular kind of silence that falls over a man when he realizes he has run out of options and does not know how to ask for help. Samuel Harper had walked into that bank behind him. Ethan had not even heard him come in. The older rancher had listened to everything, then stepped to the counter and laid down enough money to cover the full amount without a word of explanation or a single condition attached. "You can pay me back when you're steady," Samuel had said afterward outside on the street. "And if you never get steady, that's all right too. Consider it a gift from one stubborn fool to another." Ethan had paid him back inside of 2 years, every dollar. Samuel had accepted the money without ceremony and invited him to supper. They had been something close to friends ever since. Not the kind of friends who visited often or wrote long letters. The kind who understood each other across distance. The kind who would show up without being asked if the other man truly needed them. Ethan opened the letter standing on the porch. "Ethan, if you are reading this, then I am already gone. I am sorry for the abruptness of that. You know I was never a man for softening hard things. I am writing this in my better hours, while I still have them, because there are arrangements that need to be made, and I am running out of time to make them properly. My daughter Abigail is going to need help. I will not dress that up. She is strong, and she is smart, and she is more capable than most men I have known, but the situation she is walking into is not one that strength alone will carry her through. There are people circling what I am leaving behind who have been planning this for longer than she knows, and she is going to find herself without allies in a place that has decided she is easier to destroy than to protect. You are the only man I trust completely, Ethan. I have thought about this carefully, and I keep arriving at the same answer. If she comes to you and I have told her she may, I am asking you to help her, in whatever way makes sense. I am not asking you to take on more than you can carry. I am just asking you not to turn her away. She deserves better than what is coming for her if she faces it alone. Samuel. Ethan read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and stood there looking out at the gray morning sky for a long time. Samuel Harper was dead. The knowledge settled over him slowly, the way cold settles into a room when the fire goes out. Not shock exactly. Samuel had been in failing health for the better part of 2 years, and a man who has watched enough people die learns to read the approach of it in a certain kind of quietness that surrounds them near the end. Ethan had suspected it was coming, but suspecting a thing and receiving the confirmation of it are two entirely different experiences. He had not known Abigail well. He had met her perhaps 4 or 5 times over the years, always briefly, always in the context of her father. He remembered her as someone with her father's directness and her mother's careful composure, a woman who did not fill silences unnecessarily. He had respected that about her, without thinking much more about it. He went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and tried to think clearly about what the letter meant. He was still sitting there at dusk when he heard the sound of a horse on the road. He went to the door. The rain had started sometime in the afternoon, the kind of steady, relentless Montana rain that does not announce itself with thunder, but simply arrives and intends to stay. The road that curved up toward his ranch was dark and slick, and the figure coming along it on foot, the horse, was gone. He realized she was walking was soaked through to the skin. Ethan stepped off the porch without thinking about it and walked out to meet her. Abigail Harper looked nothing like the woman he remembered. The composed, carefully held person he had met at her father's table was gone. What he saw walking toward him through the rain was someone who had been through something that had taken a great deal out of her and left very little in its place. She was carrying a single suitcase. Her coat was soaked. Her boots were caked with mud from the road. And she was holding herself together by a quality of sheer, deliberate will that Ethan recognized because he had spent years doing exactly the same thing. She stopped when she saw him coming toward her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said, "Your ranch hand at the edge of the property told me you were still here. I wasn't sure you would be." "I got your father's letter this morning," Ethan said. Something moved across her face at the mention of her father. She absorbed it without letting it show past a slight tightening around her eyes. "Then you know why I've come," she said. "Come inside," he said. "You need to get dry." She hesitated for just a moment, a flicker of something that might have been pride or caution or both, and then she nodded and followed him back toward the house. He put her coat near the fire and made more coffee and did not ask her anything until the color had come back into her face and her hands had stopped shaking around the cup. Then he sat across from her at the kitchen table and waited. "He died 11 days ago," she said. "I was with him." He went quietly. He was ready. "I'm sorry," Ethan said. He wasn't afraid. She looked at the cup in her hands. He was more worried about me than about himself. That was very like him. "He mentioned in his letter that you might be coming," Ethan said. "He didn't tell me the particulars. He said the situation was complicated." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That's one way to say it." She set the cup down. "Our ranch manager. His name is Gerald Crane. He has worked for my father for 9 years. My father trusted him the way you trust someone you have watched closely for a long time and never given you reason to doubt." She paused. 3 days after my father died, Crane produced documents claiming that my father had signed over a significant portion of the Harper land to him as a private settlement of debts. Documents I had never seen, debts I had no knowledge of. "Forged," Ethan said. "I believe so. But believing it and proving it are two entirely different problems." The county clerk's office recorded the transfer. The local attorney who reviewed the documents said they appeared legitimate. The deputy sheriff told me that without clear evidence of fraud, there was nothing to be done. Her voice was even, measured, but her hands had tightened around the cup again. "Crane has been careful. Whoever helped him was careful. I spent the better part of a week trying to find someone who would help me challenge the transfer, and I ran into the same wall every direction I turned." "He has friends in the right places," Ethan said. "He has something better than friends," she said. "He has money. And money purchases patience and silence and paperwork far more reliably than friendship does." She looked up at him, then directly the way her father used to. "I was also told by 2 separate people that suspicion had begun to circulate in town. That people were beginning to wonder whether my father's death had been entirely natural, that I had perhaps been in a hurry to inherit." The kitchen was very quiet. "They're trying to discredit you," Ethan said, "before you can challenge them." "Yes. If people start believing that you lose any ground you might have to stand on." "Yes." He looked at her. She looked back at him. There was no performance in her face, no attempt to manipulate the moment. Just the plain fact of her situation, laid out between them like a map with very few good roads on it. "Your father's letter said you might need help," Ethan said slowly. He didn't say what kind of help he had in mind. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He told me before he died that if I found myself truly out of options, I should come here. He said you were the only man he trusted without reservation." She paused. "He also said something else." Ethan waited. "He said you were alone," Abigail said. "He said you had been alone for a long time, and that you deserved better than that." She looked down at the table between them. He thought, and I want to say plainly, that this was his thought, not a demand, not a condition, just something he said in the way he said things when he wanted you to think about them. He thought that perhaps a legal arrangement, a marriage, it would protect me from the rumors. It would give me standing. And he thought it might give you something too. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Outside, the rain continued steady and even against the windows. "You don't have to answer that the way he meant it," she said. "If you're willing to let me stay and help on the ranch while I fight this legally, I will work for the arrangement. I am not helpless, and I am not afraid of hard work. I'm not asking you to take care of me." "What are you asking?" Ethan said. She looked at him steadily. "I'm asking you not to turn me away." The words landed quietly. He recognized them from his father's letter. He suspected she knew that. He suspected Samuel had told her to say exactly that, knowing he would recognize them, knowing what they would mean to Ethan Walker, who had spent the better part of his adult life watching people turn away from him. After a long moment, he said, "I have a spare room. You're welcome to it tonight." "Thank you. The roof leaks on the east side when it rains hard. I'll put a bucket in." Something crossed her face. The first softening he had seen since she walked in out of the rain. "That's all right," she said. "I don't mind a leaky roof." She slept in the spare room that night, and Ethan sat up late by the fire with the letter in his hands, reading it again and once more after that. He was a man who had spent 13 years building a life in deliberate isolation. Not because he had wanted isolation exactly, but because the world had made it clear enough in the way the world makes things clear to men who carry visible scars that the easier solution for everyone involved was for him to stay on his side of the distance. He had learned to want very little. He had learned to ask for nothing. He had learned to close down the parts of himself that required other people to remain alive, and he had gotten good enough at it that he rarely noticed anymore what those closed rooms had once contained. Samuel Harper had been one of the very few people who had walked through all of that without being asked to and without making a production of it. And now Samuel was gone, and his daughter was asleep in the spare room with the leaky roof. And there was a letter in Ethan's hands from a dead man asking him to do something that frightened him in ways he did not entirely have language for. He put the letter down eventually and looked at the fire for a while. Then he said quietly to no one in particular, "All right, Samuel, all right." In the morning, Abigail was already up when he came downstairs. She had made coffee. She was standing at the window looking out at the ranch still and thoughtful, and she turned when she heard him on the stairs and said without preamble, "The fence line along the south pasture has 3 sections down. I could see it from the window. The livestock will drift if it isn't repaired before the weather turns harder." Ethan looked at her. "I notice the vegetable garden is in poor shape too," she said. "What's left in it won't last much longer." "I've been short-handed," he said. "I can see that." She held out the coffee cup. "I'm not criticizing. I'm telling you what I can help with if you'll have me." He took the cup. "Can you ride?" "My father had me on a horse before I could read." "The south fence is a half-day's work at minimum." "Then we should start early," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and then something shifted in him, something small and long-rusted that had not moved in a very long time, and he said, "Get your coat." That afternoon, working side by side in the cold air with the fence posts and the wire, he told her he would do it. Marry her if she was willing. In a courthouse, nothing elaborate, just the legal fact of it. So that she had standing. So that the rumors had less to attach themselves to. so that when she went to fight what Gerald Crane had done, she was not a lone woman without roots or protection, but a wife with a husband and a home. She listened to him say all of it without interrupting, which he appreciated, because he was not practiced at saying things like that, and he needed to get through it without losing his place. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You don't have to do this. I know that. It will complicate your life." "My life is not complicated enough to require protecting," he said. "Yours is." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass of the pasture around them. A horse shifted somewhere in the distance. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They went back to the fence. The courthouse ceremony was held 3 days later on a Tuesday morning, with the county clerk and his wife as witnesses. Ethan wore the only good jacket he owned. Abigail wore a dark blue dress that had belonged to her mother. There were no flowers. No celebration afterward. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon in the cold November air, and neither of them said very much, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had made a serious decision and were each privately reckoning with what it meant. When they got back, Ethan unhitched the horse and Abigail started supper. And that was the beginning of something that neither of them had a name for yet, and were not in those early days brave enough to look at directly. What they had instead was work. There was always work. The fence lines, the livestock. The accounts that Abigail began reorganizing with a precision that quietly astonished Ethan, who had never been comfortable with numbers. She found places where money was leaking out of the ranch operation that he had never noticed. She renegotiated terms with 2 suppliers in town without telling him she was going to do it, and came home and told him what she had done and what it would save them over the course of a winter. And he stared at her across the kitchen table and said, "How did you manage that?" "I asked directly and did not accept the first answer," she said. "And I brought the competitor's price with me in writing." "You bluffed them." "I had the numbers. It wasn't a bluff." He shook his head slowly. Not disapproval, something else. "Your father should have told me more about you." "My father told everyone less than they expected," she said. And for a moment the grief moved across her face and was gone. "He thought people should find things out for themselves." Ethan nodded. "That sounds like him." She looked at him. "He talked about you, though. More than you probably know." Ethan was quiet. "He said you were the most honest man he had ever met," she said. "He said that was rare enough to be worth knowing." Ethan looked down at the table. The words settled somewhere inside him and stayed there the way good things do when you have spent a long time not receiving them. "He was a good man," Ethan said finally. "He was," she said, "the best I knew." Outside, the first real winter was beginning to close around the Montana hills. Inside the small ranch house, 2 people who were still strangers in most of the ways that mattered were sitting across a kitchen table in the lamplight. And neither of them was alone. Neither of them had been expecting that. Neither of them was entirely sure yet what to do with it. But the fire was burning and the supper was good and the night outside was very cold, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan Walker came home to a house where someone was waiting. That was not nothing. That, as it turned out, was everything. The first time Ethan saw Abigail cry, she did not know he was watching. It was early morning, still dark enough that the ranch yard was more shadow than shape, and he had come downstairs earlier than usual because he had not slept well. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her father's ledger open in front of her, the one she had brought in her suitcase, the only record of the Harper Ranch accounts that Crane had not managed to seize, and she had one hand pressed flat against the open page like she was trying to hold something inside it. Her shoulders were shaking slightly, not loudly. The way a person cries when they have had a great deal of practice making sure no one hears them. Ethan stood at the bottom of the stairs and did not move. After a moment, she straightened, pressed the back of her hand against her eyes, and closed the ledger. Then she stood, smoothed her skirt, and turned to put the kettle on. That was when she saw him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I didn't hear you come down," she said. Her voice was steady. Whatever had been happening at the table was already locked back behind something composed and careful. "Couldn't sleep," he said. She nodded and turned back to the stove. "Coffee will be ready in a few minutes." He sat down at the table. The ledger was there between them. He did not look at it directly, but he was aware of it the way you are aware of something that holds a great deal of weight. "How bad is it?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Worse than I thought. Crane didn't just take the land parcels my father supposedly signed over. He's been redirecting income from the cattle sales for at least 2 years. Small amounts at a time. Nothing large enough to notice easily in a single season." She set 2 cups on the table and sat down across from him. "My father trusted him completely. He wouldn't have looked. He wasn't the kind of man who looked for betrayal in people he had already decided were trustworthy." "That's not a flaw," Ethan said. "No," she said. "But it's expensive." She looked at the ledger. "There's a pattern in these numbers if you know what you're looking for. I've been trained in accounting since I was 12. My father wanted me to understand the business. I don't think Crane knew that." She looked up. "That's our best advantage right now. He believes I am an upset, grieving woman with no real understanding of what he has taken or how to prove it. He has underestimated me." "Good," Ethan said. "Let him." She looked at him for a moment, something in his expression apparently matching something she had not expected, and then she said, "You understand that." "I've spent most of my life being underestimated," he said. "I know what to do with it." She studied him. Then very quietly she said, "Yes, I suppose you do." The coffee was strong, and the morning was cold, and outside the ranch was waking up around them, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything more. But it was not the silence of 2 strangers. It was something slightly different, something with a little more room in it. That afternoon, Ethan drove the wagon into Silver Creek for supplies. He had not been looking forward to it. He rarely looked forward to going into town. The errands were necessary: feed salt, a new length of rope for the south barn, but the experience of moving through Silver Creek had always carried a particular quality that he had never entirely accustomed himself to, regardless of how many years had passed. The glances, the slight adjustments people made when they saw him coming. The conversations that stopped and resumed in a different key. He was loading the wagon outside Halliwell's feed store when he heard his name behind him. "Walker." He turned. 3 men were standing near the edge of the boardwalk. He recognized 2 of them ranchers from the north side of the valley, men he had done business with occasionally over the years, never warmly. The third he did not know. "Heard you got yourself married," the taller one said. His name was Pruitt. He had the particular tone of a man who was saying one thing and meaning another. "To the Harper girl." "That's right," Ethan said. He went back to loading. "Quick arrangement," Pruitt said. "Considering her father isn't in the ground 3 weeks." Ethan set the feed sack in the wagon and turned around. He looked at Pruitt steadily, the way he had learned to look at men who were measuring whether he would push back. "Samuel Harper was a friend of mine," he said. "His daughter needed help. I provided it." Pruitt exchanged a look with the man beside him. "Just seems fast is all. Some folks in town are talking, saying the Harper girl's situation is a little more complicated than a grieving daughter." "Some folks in town talk about a great many things," Ethan said. "Crane's been saying she knew about the documents, that her father had debts he wasn't advertising, and the transfer was agreed on long before he died. That the girl is trying to reverse a legal arrangement because she didn't get what she expected." Ethan looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Gerald Crane is a thief. Whatever he's been saying around this town is the kind of story a man tells when he needs people looking the wrong direction. And if the men in this town are willing to take his word over a dead man's reputation, then the men in this town aren't worth much." He picked up the last sack. "We done?" Pruitt's jaw tightened, but he did not say anything else. Ethan climbed into the wagon and drove out of town without looking back. He told Abigail about the conversation that evening plainly and without embellishment, because she had a right to know what was being said and who was saying it. She listened with her hands folded on the table and her face very still, and when he finished, she said, He's moving faster than I expected." "You expected this?" "I expected something like it. He needs the town to have already made up its mind before any legal challenge can gain traction. If the general belief is that I'm a dishonest woman trying to reverse a legitimate arrangement, then any evidence I produce will be seen as fabricated. It's a smart strategy." She paused. "Crane is not a stupid man. That's what makes him dangerous." "What do you want to do?" Ethan said. She looked at him. "I want to write to a lawyer. My father mentioned a man in Billings once, a man named Hargrove. He said the man was the kind of attorney who wasn't afraid of powerful opposition. I want to explain the situation in writing and see if he'll take the case." "All right," Ethan said. "Write the letter. I'll take it to town day after tomorrow." She nodded. Then she said, "Ethan." He looked at her. "What you said to Pruitt," she said. "I want you to know you didn't have to defend me like that. And I'm grateful you did." He shook his head slightly. "I said what was true." "A lot of people know what's true and choose not to say it," she said. "That's the whole problem." He had no answer for that, but the words stayed with him, pressing lightly against something inside him that had been closed for a long time. December arrived without ceremony. The cold came down hard off the mountains, and the ranch work shifted into the heavier rhythms of winter preparation. Ethan and Abigail worked from first light until dark most days, and the strange intimacy of shared hard labor began to do what it always does to two people who undertake it together. It wore away the careful, formal distance between them and replaced it with something more honest and less considered. She was stronger than he had expected. Not just in the obvious physical sense, though. That was real enough. She could haul water and mend fence and lift feed sacks without complaint and without stopping to comment on the difficulty of it. She was strong in the way that people are strong who have spent their lives preparing for hardship without being entirely sure which form it would take when it arrived. She did not wait to be told what needed doing. She saw it, and she did it. And she had a particular way of moving through work that reminded him painfully and precisely of Samuel Harper, who had possessed the same quality. One evening in the second week of December, she was working on the books at the kitchen table, and Ethan was cleaning tack near the fire, and neither of them was talking when she suddenly said, "He used to sing while he worked." Ethan looked up. "My father," she said. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the page in front of her. Old hymns mostly, ones his mother had taught him. He had a terrible voice, completely tuneless. A pause. But he sang anyway because he said music was one of the things a man did for himself and not for anyone else's opinion. Ethan did not say anything. "I keep reaching for him," she said. Not dramatically, just in the ordinary way. "I'll think I should tell my father this, or I'll want to ask his advice about something, and I'll get halfway through forming the thought before I remember." She pressed her lips together. "I suppose that goes on for a long time." "It does," Ethan said. "My mother died when I was 19. I reached for her for years." She looked at him. It was the first personal thing he had told her since she arrived, and both of them knew it. "I'm sorry," she said. "She would have liked you," he said, and then was somewhat surprised to discover that he meant it. Something shifted in Abigail's face. Small. Private. She turned back to the books, but she was almost smiling. The letter to Hargrove in Billings went out on a Wednesday. The reply came back in 10 days, which was fast enough to mean the man was either very interested or very efficient, and the content of the letter suggested he was both. He had heard of Gerald Crane, he wrote. He had also heard things about the financial connections between certain county officials and several of the larger landowners in the Silver Creek area that had never been formally investigated. He believed there might be a case. He would need to see the ledger. He would need whatever documentation Abigail had managed to preserve. He would need to come to Silver Creek and conduct his own inquiries quietly before he could say anything more definitive. Abigail read the letter 3 times. Then she handed it to Ethan across the breakfast table without speaking because she did not trust her voice in that moment. He read it and looked up at her. "It's a beginning," he said. "It's more than I had last week," she said. It's more than that, he said. He said he'd heard things. That means we're not the only ones who've noticed. That means there are other threads to pull. She pressed her hand flat on the table. Not the grief gesture from the morning with the ledger. Something else. Something resolute. I want to take this apart piece by piece, she said. I want every fraudulent document exposed and every man who helped Crane do this to stand in public and account for it. Ethan looked at her. Then that's what we'll do. She nodded slowly. You keep saying we. Is that a problem? No, she said. It's just I'm not accustomed to it. Neither am I, he said. The word landed between them with a weight that neither of them examined too closely, but that both of them felt. The second week of December brought a different kind of trouble. Ethan was in the barn early one morning when he heard Abigail's voice from the yard, sharp and controlled in a way that told him immediately something was wrong. He came out to find a man he did not recognize standing at the edge of the property near the gate, and Abigail standing 10 feet away with her arms crossed and her expression somewhere between fury and careful restraint. I told him to leave, she said when Ethan came up beside her. He says he has a message from Mr. Crane. Ethan looked at the man. He was well-dressed for a ranch road in December. The kind of well-dressed that belonged to a lawyer or an intermediary, not a working man. He was holding an envelope. Mr. Walker, the man said. He had the polished, uninflected tone of someone accustomed to delivering unpleasant information in pleasant language. My employer wishes to express his condolences on the recent passing of Mr. Harper, and his hope that the period of adjustment has not been too trying. He also wishes to convey a private offer made in good faith, which he believes may serve everyone's interests considerably better than a prolonged legal dispute. Say what you came to say, Ethan said. The man extended the envelope. Inside you'll find an offer of settlement, a sum of money in full to be paid to Mrs. Walker. He paused almost imperceptibly on the name as if testing it. In exchange for a signed agreement withdrawing all current and future claims against the land transfer and associated transactions. Abigail took the envelope, opened it, read it, and handed it to Ethan without changing her expression. Ethan read the number on the page. It was not a small number. It was the kind of number designed to look generous enough to seem like good faith, but small enough that any lawyer examining the underlying value of what was being protected would see it for the insult it was. He handed the envelope back to the man. No, he said. Mr. Walker, I would encourage you to consider. My wife said no, Ethan said. I said no. You can go back and tell your employer that the answer is no, and that if he sends someone to this property again with an offer of settlement, he will be speaking to our attorney instead of to us. The man looked at Abigail. She met his gaze without blinking. He looked at Ethan. Ethan did not move. There was a particular quality to Ethan Walker's stillness that most people, upon encountering it directly, found they did not want to test. This man, whoever he was, had enough experience reading situations to recognize it. He put the envelope in his coat pocket, turned, and rode back down the road. Abigail let out a slow breath. He's scared, she said. He's trying to make this go away before Hargrove arrives, Ethan said. Which means he knows Hargrove is coming. She turned to look at him. He has someone watching, someone who knew about the letter. The knowledge settled over both of them. Someone in the system, the post office, the county clerk. Someone was reporting back to Crane. We'll be more careful, Ethan said. From here on, anything that matters goes through Billings by a route he doesn't know about. She nodded. Her jaw was set. Good. Christmas came and went quietly on the Walker Ranch. There was no celebration to speak of. Ethan had stopped marking it years ago, and Abigail, in her grief, had no appetite for the form of it. But on Christmas morning she made a breakfast that was considerably more elaborate than the usual, with biscuits and eggs, and a preserve she had been keeping back that her father's cook had put up in October, and she set it on the table without comment. Ethan sat down and looked at the table and then at her. It's Christmas, she said simply. It is, he said. My father always made a point of the table at Christmas, she said, even when there wasn't much to put on it. He said the effort was the point. Ethan looked at the meal she had made, and felt something move in his chest that he did not immediately have language for. He had eaten alone at this table for so many years that the presence of food made with care and intention still startled him sometimes, still registered as an unexpected gift. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in ways he could not have enumerated. She sat down across from him. "He would have liked this," she said. "Seeing us both here." She paused. "He was always trying to get you to come to supper. You know that." "I know. You always found a reason not to." He considered that. "I wasn't very good at supper," he said finally. She smiled. It was the most unguarded expression he had seen from her, quick and real, and gone before he could look at it directly. "You're getting better," she said. He looked down at his plate. "Am I?" "Yes," she said, "considerably." The new year brought two things in quick succession. The first was Hargrove himself arriving in Silver Creek on a Tuesday in early January, without announcement, which was exactly as he had planned it. He was a compact man in his late 50s, with the permanently watchful expression of someone who had spent decades listening to everything people said and everything they chose not to say. He came to the ranch first, before he showed himself in town, and he sat at the kitchen table with Abigail's ledger and her collection of documents for 2 full hours, while Ethan made coffee and stayed out of the way. When he was done, he sat back and said, "Miss Harper, Mrs. Walker, this is not just a case of forged documents." "No," Abigail said. "This is the tail end of something considerably larger." He tapped the ledger with 2 fingers. "The pattern in these accounts matches patterns I have seen in 3 other situations in this territory over the past several years. Different ranches, different managers, same methodology, small consistent redirections, strategic timing, always following a death or incapacitation that was either natural or made to look natural." The kitchen was very quiet. "Are you saying my father's death?" Abigail stopped. "I am not prepared to say that," Hargrove said carefully. "What I am saying is that the context is troubling enough that it needs to be part of what we examine." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to understand what that means. This case may become considerably more serious than a land dispute. It may attract attention from people who have strong reasons to want it to go away. The danger to you and your husband may increase." Abigail looked at Ethan. He looked back at her. Then she turned to Hargrove and said, "Tell me what you need." The second thing the new year brought arrived not as information, but as action. On a Thursday night in the second week of January, Ethan woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of horses on the road. More than one horse, moving fast, moving toward the ranch and not past it. He was out of bed before the thought was fully formed, moving through the dark house, with the particular efficient speed of a man who had spent years in isolated country and understood that noises in the night were taken seriously, or they were taken too late. He had his rifle in his hands before he reached the bottom of the stairs. Abigail was already in the hallway. "I heard them," she said quietly. "Get back from the windows," he said. "Go to the back of the house." "I'm not—" "Abigail!" He looked at her directly. "I need to know you're not in front of a window. I can't do what needs doing if I'm worried about where you are. Please." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded and moved toward the back of the house, and he felt something loosen slightly in his chest. He went to the front window and looked. 3 riders. They had stopped at the barn. He could see the glow of something orange, and he understood immediately what it was and what it meant, and he was out the front door and running before the thought was fully articulated. "Hey!" he shouted into the dark. "Hey!" 2 of the 3 riders broke for the road immediately. The third stayed a moment longer enough to throw something toward the base of the barn, and then he was gone too, hooves hammering fast down the dark road and away. Ethan got to the barn with a horse blanket and beat out the small fire before it could find the walls. The thing that had been thrown was a bundle of oil-soaked rags. In the dry cold of January, with a wooden barn full of winter hay, it would have been enough. He stood in the dark yard with the charred blanket in his hands and breathed. Abigail was there. She had not stayed in the back of the house. She was standing 5 feet away, a lantern in her hand, watching him with an expression that held several things at once: relief, fury, and something else that she was not yet ready to say out loud. "They were going to burn it," she said. "Yes." "Crane." "Almost certainly." He looked at her. "You didn't stay in the back." "I got the lantern," she said, "and I was ready to use it as a weapon if any of them had come to the house." She looked down at the charred blanket in his hands. "Are you all right?" He realized he was shaking slightly. Not fear exactly. The aftermath of fast action when the body has flooded itself with urgency and is not yet certain it is over. "I'm fine," he said. She reached out and took the blanket from his hands. And then, without ceremony and without apparent planning, she put her other hand briefly on his forearm and held it there. He went very still. "Thank you," she said, "for running out here, for not hesitating." He did not say anything. She let go. Stepped back, held the lantern up. "We should check the rest of the property." "Yes," he said. They moved through the rest of the ranch together in the dark, checking every building, every corner the whole time without speaking much. The cold was sharp and clear, and the stars were hard and bright overhead. Their breath made small clouds in the dark air between them. When they were done, when they had confirmed that nothing else had been touched, they stood in the yard for a moment, side by side, looking out at the ranch. They had both in different ways staked themselves too. "I'm not going to let them scare us off," Abigail said. "No," he said. "I want to write to Hargrove in the morning. He needs to know about this. It changes the timeline of what we can afford." "First light," he said. "We'll write it together." She turned to look at him. In the lantern light, her face was composed and determined and very tired, and there was something under all of that he had not allowed himself to look at directly until this moment, and looking at it now, he understood that it had been there for some time. He looked away. Back at the dark edge of the property where the riders had gone. "Go inside," he said. "I'll stay up and watch for a while." "I'll stay up with you," she said. "Abigail." "Ethan." She said his name the way she sometimes said things quietly, but with the full weight of her intention behind it. "I'm not going inside to wait alone while you stand out here by yourself in the cold. We're past that." He looked at her, and she was right. Whatever they had been in October, whatever careful arrangement of necessity and practicality they had constructed in those first weeks, they were past that now. The thing between them had moved without announcement, the way water moves underground unseen, following its own logic, arriving somewhere neither of them had quite planned on. He did not say that. He was not ready to say that, but he stood beside her in the cold January dark, watching the road. And when his arm rested close enough to hers that she would have felt the warmth of it, he did not move away. They stood there together until the sky in the east began to lighten. And in the morning, they wrote the letter to Hargrove, and the ranch was still standing, and whatever Gerald Crane had believed he would accomplish by sending 3 men with oil-soaked rags into the dark, he had accomplished something else entirely. He had made Ethan Walker stop pretending he did not care what happened to Abigail Harper. And that, as it turned out, was the most dangerous mistake anyone in Silver Creek had made in a very long time. Hargrove read the letter about the barn before he had even taken his coat off. He had come back to the ranch unannounced again, the same way he had the first time, arriving on a gray February morning with mud on his boots and a leather satchel under his arm that looked heavier than it had in January. He read standing up, which told Ethan something about the kind of man he was, the kind who processed urgency on his feet. When he finished, he folded the letter and set it on the table. "They're escalating," he said. "Yes," Abigail said. "That tells me something." He sat down, then opened the satchel and began laying papers on the table with the deliberate economy of a man who had organized his thinking carefully before arriving. Frightened men escalate. Men who believe they have time do not send riders in the night with oil rags. They wait. They maneuver. They use the system. He looked up. Crane believes the system is beginning to turn against him. "Is it?" Ethan said, slowly. Hargrove pulled a folded document from the satchel. "I've been in contact with a federal land examiner in Helena, quietly. He has been looking at transfer patterns in 3 counties, including this one for reasons entirely unrelated to our case. When I described what I found in Mrs. Walker's ledger, he went very still in a way that told me he had seen something similar somewhere else." He placed the document on the table. "He is willing to cooperate. He is not willing to move openly yet, because moving openly at this stage would destroy what he is building. But he is watching, and he is taking notes." Abigail leaned forward. "What does that mean for the timeline?" "It means we need to hold," Hargrove said. "We need to stay visible, stay credible, and not give Crane anything he can use to discredit us before the federal involvement becomes public." He looked between them. "It also means that what happened with those riders cannot happen again without a formal report. Every act of intimidation needs to be documented. Every threat, every messenger, every person Crane sends to this property needs to be recorded with dates and names and details." "We've been keeping records," Abigail said. Hargrove looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. The professional neutrality softened slightly into something that resembled genuine respect. "Good," he said. "Keep doing it. Everything." After he left, Abigail stood at the kitchen window for a long time without speaking. Ethan watched her from across the room, the way he had begun to watch her without quite acknowledging that he was doing it not intrusively, just with a kind of attention that had become habitual, the way breathing becomes habitual. "You're thinking about your father," he said. She did not turn around. "I'm thinking about what Hargrove said, about frightened men." She paused. "Crane knew my father. He worked beside him for 9 years. He ate at our table. He was at my father's bedside when he was sick." Her voice stayed level, but the evenness of it cost her something. "Whatever he is, he was not always this. Something made him decide that my father's trust was worth less than what he could take from him. Greed does that," Ethan said. "It convinces a man that what he wants is something he deserves. And once he believes that everything that stands between him and it stops being a person and starts being an obstacle." She turned then, looked at him. "You sound like you've thought about that." "I've had time to think about a lot of things," he said. She studied him for a moment with that direct, considering gaze that reminded him so forcefully of her father that it still caught him off guard occasionally. Then she said, "I'm going to write to the county clerk, formally, requesting a full accounting of every land transfer recorded in the past 3 years involving Harper property. He'll delay, yes, but a formal written request creates a record. And when Hargrove's federal contact is ready to move, that record of delay becomes evidence." She moved toward the table, sat down, pulled a sheet of paper toward her. "They've been counting on me being too frightened or too overwhelmed to be systematic about this. I want to show them what systematic looks like." Ethan looked at her, bent over the paper, writing in the clean, precise hand she had inherited from a father who believed in the moral weight of legible documents, and he felt something he had given up, expecting something that lived in the chest and would not be reasoned out of its location. He went to put more wood on the fire before she could look up and see his face. The letter to the county clerk produced exactly the response they had anticipated. 3 weeks of silence followed by a reply so dense with procedural language and bureaucratic redirection that Abigail read it twice before she was certain it contained no actual information at all. She handed it to Ethan without comment and watched him read it. "He stalled," Ethan said. "Beautifully," she said. "I almost admire the craftsmanship." She took the letter back. "I'm writing it again, more specific this time, citing the exact statutes that require disclosure, and I'm sending a copy to Hargrove. You know the statutes. I know a great many things that people in this county have apparently not counted on." She picked up her pen. "My father educated me deliberately and extensively because he believed that a woman who understood the law could not be easily exploited by it." She paused. "He was right. He was just a few months too late." The grief in those last words was quick and precise, like a knife moved through something and withdrawn immediately. Ethan did not pretend he hadn't heard it. He knew what he was doing. Ethan said. "Sending you here. He knew the education he gave you would matter." She looked up. "He wasn't too late," Ethan said. "He just didn't live long enough to see it work. That's different." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back down at the paper and said in a voice that was very slightly unsteady, "Thank you." It was a small exchange. It would not have appeared significant to anyone watching from the outside. But between the two of them, in the particular grammar of what they had become to each other, it meant a great deal. February deepened, and the ranch held. Neighbors began to notice. Not with grand gestures. This was Montana ranch country in the 1890s, and grand gestures were not the local currency, but in the small practical ways that rural communities express their recalibration of a situation. A rancher named Aldous Webb, from the neighboring property, began timing his fence checks to coincide with the hours after dark. And on 2 occasions, his presence on the adjoining land had apparently discouraged further nighttime visits to the Walker Ranch. He never mentioned it directly. Neither did Ethan. But when Webb's wagon got stuck in a creek crossing the following week, Ethan was there with rope and horses within the hour, and Webb clasped his hand afterward with the grip of a man communicating something that went beyond gratitude for the assistance. A woman named Clara Holt, who ran the dry goods store at the edge of town, started setting aside good cuts of salt pork for Abigail when she came in without being asked. She also, on one occasion, leaned across the counter and said in a low voice, "There are more people in this town that know what Crane is than he thinks. They're just scared. You keep pushing, and some of them will find their courage." Abigail thanked her quietly and carried that home with her like something precious. She told Ethan about it that evening, and he listened and said, "Clara Holt's husband lost 40 acres to a tax dispute 8 years ago that nobody in town ever believed was legitimate." Abigail looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because I was paying attention when everyone else was pretending not to notice." He paused. "I've been the person the town looks past for a long time. You notice things from that position that you miss when you're in the center of it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I keep underestimating what you see." "Most people do," he said, not bitterly, just factually. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't mean to." "You don't do it the way most people do," he said. "You correct it when you catch it. That's more than most." She looked at him steadily. "You're a very particular kind of person, Ethan Walker. Is that good or bad?" "It's rare," she said, "which in my experience is usually good." He looked at the fire, said nothing. But the thing in his chest that had taken up residence there in recent weeks settled a little deeper into its place and showed no signs of leaving. The first week of March brought Margaret Blackwood. Ethan had heard the name before. Abigail arrived. Blackwood was one of the largest landowners in the valley, a widow of considerable wealth and considerably more social ambition, who had cultivated her position in Silver Creek society with the same patient, deliberate methodology that she apparently applied to everything she wanted. She was not a woman people crossed openly. She was too useful to too many people for open crossing to be practical. She arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon in a buggy that was conspicuously fine for a ranch road in early March, driven by a man who sat with the careful posture of someone employed to imply importance through proximity. Abigail saw the buggy coming from the window and said without turning around, "We have company." Ethan came to look. "Blackwood," he said. Abigail turned then. "You know her." "I know who she is," he said. "She bought the Fenner land 2 years ago for a third of its value after Fenner's wife died, and he couldn't hold the operation together alone. The sale was legal. The circumstances that made it necessary were not entirely natural." Abigail processed that quickly. He could see her doing it, filing it, connecting it, placing it in the architecture she had been building for months. "She's connected to Crane," she said. "That would be my guess." "Then this is not a social call." "No," he said. "It is not." He went to meet the buggy at the gate. Abigail came with him a half step behind, and to his left, not because she needed him in front of her, but because they had developed without discussing it a way of moving into difficult situations that placed them both in the best position to respond to whatever the situation required. Margaret Blackwood was a woman in her mid-60s who had once been conventionally handsome and had refined herself over the years into something more formidable than beauty. She wore her authority the way some women wear jewelry, not ostentatiously, but with the clear intention of being noticed. She looked at Ethan first, then at Abigail, and the sequence of that look told Abigail everything she needed to know about how this woman had decided to approach the conversation. "Mr. Walker," Blackwood said, "I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time." "Mrs. Blackwood," Ethan said, "what can we do for you?" The phrasing was deliberate. We and Abigail saw Blackwood register it. "I wanted to introduce myself to your wife," Blackwood said, turning to Abigail with a smile that had been constructed with considerable skill. "I've been meaning to come since the wedding. I'm afraid my social duties have kept me rather occupied." "That's quite all right," Abigail said. "Mrs. Blackwood, I've heard your name." "Nothing too dreadful, I hope." The smile did not waver. "Nothing I've formed a final opinion on," Abigail said pleasantly. Something moved behind Blackwood's eyes. Reassessment. She had expected deference or anxiety, or the particular performance of friendliness that insecure people put on for powerful ones. She had not expected that. "I'll come to the point," Blackwood said. "I've been concerned, as have a number of people in this community, about the legal trouble surrounding your father's estate. These sorts of disputes can become very damaging to everyone involved, including people who may not entirely deserve the damage." "How thoughtful of you," Abigail said. "I have some experience in these matters," Blackwood continued, "and it has been my observation that early resolution, even imperfect resolution, tends to serve all parties better than protracted legal conflict. The reputational cost alone." "Mrs. Blackwood," Abigail said, and something in her voice changed, not louder, not harder, just more precisely itself. "I appreciate that you've come a long way on a poor road to say this to me. So I want to be equally direct with you in return. I am not interested in early resolution. I am not interested in imperfect resolution. I am interested in the truth about what was taken from my father's estate, who took it, who helped them take it, and what accountability looks like for everyone involved in that." She paused. "If that process is damaging to people who had a hand in it, then I would suggest that the damage was always going to come. It was simply a question of when." Silence. Blackwood looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Ethan. He looked back at her with an expression that communicated without particular aggression that there was nothing she was going to find in his face that would be more useful to her than what Abigail had just said. "I see," Blackwood said finally. "I think you do," Abigail said. "I hope you have a safe drive back." Blackwood's driver clicked the horses forward, and the buggy turned and went back down the road. Ethan stood beside Abigail and watched it go. Then he said, "That was something." "She came to measure me," Abigail said. "I wanted her to leave knowing exactly what she had measured." "She'll go back to Crane." "Yes, and she'll tell him that the settlement offer isn't going to work, and that there isn't enough fear in this house to make it work." She looked at Ethan. "Let him know that. Let him think about what that means." That night after supper, a wind came down off the mountains. It started quietly, the way the worst Montana storms always start. A suggestion, a shift in the air pressure, a sound at the edge of hearing that takes a few minutes to resolve into something you can name. By the time Ethan went to bed, he could hear it building against the north side of the house, and he lay awake listening to it, the way he had lain awake listening to 100 other storms in this house over the years. And he thought about the livestock and the hay stores and the roof above the east barn that needed new boards. And then he stopped thinking about those things and thought instead about the sound of Abigail's voice saying, "I am interested in the truth." In the flat March cold with Margaret Blackwood standing in front of her, and he put one arm across his face and stared at the dark ceiling of his room and said nothing to no one for a long time. By midnight, the storm had made its intentions clear. He was up and dressed before it fully arrived because that was the only sensible response to a storm of this size when you had animals to protect and buildings that had not all been built to withstand the worst that March in Montana was capable of producing. He pulled his coat on in the hallway and found Abigail already there. "I heard it," she said. She had her coat on, her boots. Her hair was loose, which he had not seen before, and he registered it and did not register it in the same moment and moved past it. "I need to get to the south barn," he said. "The roof." "I know. I'll take the horses to the north shelter. They'll panic if they're in the south barn when that roof goes." "You don't need to." "Ethan?" She looked at him with an expression that had long since moved past argument. "Go." He went. The wind hit him like something solid the moment he was out the door. He moved through it with his head down, and his shoulders set against it, the way you move through something that wants to push you backward when you cannot afford to go backward. The south barn was 40 yards from the house. It took him longer than it should have. He could hear above the wind the particular distressed sound of the hay stores shifting. The kind of sound that means something structural is under more pressure than it was built to handle. He got the barn doors open and got inside and started working. He was midway through securing the interior supports when he heard it. Not the wind this time, not the hay, something else. A sound from outside. Not the horses. Abigail had the horses. Something falling. Something very large falling. Then he heard her voice. Not words, just a sound. The kind of sound a person makes when they do not have time to make words. He was out the barn door before the thought was fully formed, and he saw it happening as he came through the massive cottonwood at the north corner of the property. A tree that had stood longer than any building on the ranch, the storm taking its top half and bringing it sideways, and Abigail was directly below it. She had come back from the shelter, and she had not seen it coming. She was looking back toward the barn. She was looking for him. She did not see the tree. Ethan ran. He did not think about running. He did not decide to run. His body simply went moving at a speed that had nothing to do with calculation and everything to do with something far more elemental than thought. He hit her at the shoulders, both arms around her. Driving forward, and the tree came down where she had been standing with a sound like a cannon shot. The ground shaking under them as he carried her forward and down and covered her with his body, while the secondary branches came crashing through the space around them. Then it was still. Relatively still. The wind still screamed, but the tree had stopped moving. Ethan lifted his head. Abigail was underneath him, face turned to the side, breathing in sharp, irregular bursts that meant she was not hurt badly enough to have stopped breathing and was trying to get her lungs restarted after the impact. "Are you hurt?" he said. She tried to move, stopped, took a breath. "I don't think so. Are you?" "I'm fine." He started to move off her and felt it, then the branch that had caught him across the left side along the ribs. He stopped moving. "Ethan?" She turned to look at him, saw his face. "You're not fine." "I can walk," he said. "That's fine enough." He got them both up, which took longer than walking to the barn had, and he walked bent slightly to the left, because straightening caused the kind of pain that makes the edges of vision go white, and Abigail had her arm around him, and she was not asking permission, and he was not arguing about it. They got back to the house. She got him inside. "Sit," she said. "The barn." "Sit down," she said. Not loudly, but with an authority that he obeyed without deciding to. He sat at the kitchen table, and she brought the lamp close and looked at his side with careful hands that pressed in ways that told her what she needed to know by what they produced in him. She was methodical about it, precise. He watched her work and noted distantly that her hands were not shaking, which he respected because his certainly would have been. "2 ribs at minimum," she said. "Possibly 3. None of them feel displaced, which means they're cracked and not broken through." She looked up at him. "You need to breathe shallowly for a few days and not lift anything heavier than a coffee cup." "The ranch. I will handle the ranch." She said it with such finality that arguing would have required energy he did not currently have. She straightened, looked at him. And then something happened in her face that was entirely different from everything before it. The composure that had held through the storm and the tree and the examination of his ribs came apart at the edges, not dramatically, just at the edges. "You could have been killed," she said. Her voice was steady, but only just. "The tree would have killed you," he said. "I know that." She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth briefly. Then she lowered it. "I know that. I just—" She stopped, looked at the table, looked back at him. "I keep finding things I'm not ready to lose, Ethan. I've lost enough. I'm not ready to lose more." The kitchen was very quiet. He looked at her and understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with any thought he had consciously formed, that whatever he had been telling himself about this arrangement, about practicality and necessity, and the sensible limits of what two wounded people could allow themselves, all of that was a story he had been telling himself because the truth of it was considerably more frightening. He reached out and took her hand. She went still. He held it. That was all. He held her hand across the kitchen table while the storm worked itself out against the walls of the house and the lamp cast its small circle of warmth around them, and he did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would have been as honest as the gesture itself. After a long moment, she turned her hand over and held his back. They sat like that for a while. Neither of them named what was happening. Neither of them needed to. The thing between them had been building since October, since a rainy night, and a worn suitcase and a letter from a dead man who had understood something about both of them that they had not yet understood about themselves. It was building still, and in the morning everything would be different. Not because of a grand declaration, not because of a single moment that changed everything at once, but because two people who had both spent a very long time believing they were meant to be alone had sat across a table in the dark while a storm raged outside and held each other's hand, and neither of them had let go. That was the most significant thing that had happened in the Walker Ranch house in 13 years. And somewhere in whatever there is after this life, Samuel Harper was nodding quietly to himself and saying nothing, because he was not the kind of man who needed to say, "I told you so." But he was absolutely the kind of man who had known. The morning after the storm, Ethan woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Abigail already moving through the house with purpose. He lay still for a moment, breathing carefully against the pull of the cracked ribs, and listened to her. The particular rhythm of her, the way she moved through a space without wasting motion, the sound of the cast iron on the stove, the small domestic geography of a person who had made herself at home in a place without making a production of it. He had been listening to those sounds for months now, without allowing himself to name what they meant to him. This morning, lying in the gray early light with 3 cracked ribs and the memory of her hand in his, he was done pretending he did not know. He got up slowly, dressed, came downstairs. She was at the stove. She turned when she heard him on the stairs and looked at him the way she had been looking at him since last night. Not differently exactly, but more directly. Like something that had been slightly angled between them had straightened out overnight. "Sit," she said. "I'll bring it to you. I can—" Ethan. Just his name. That was all. He sat. She brought coffee and eggs and a piece of the salt pork from Clara Holt's store and set it in front of him without ceremony, and then she sat across from him with her own cup and said, "Webb came by at first light." He looked up. He saw the tree from his fence line. He brought 2 of his men. They've already started clearing it. She paused. He also said that Jim Carver from the East Road and his son are coming this afternoon to look at the south barn roof. Ethan set his fork down. "I didn't ask for that." "No," she said. "They offered." Webb said. She stopped. Something moved through her expression. He said, "You tell Walker that a man who stands up for what's right in this valley doesn't stand alone." Then he went back to work. The kitchen was quiet. Ethan looked at his plate. He was not a man who cried easily or often, and he did not cry now. But the stillness that came over him was the kind that happens when something strikes a place inside that has been waiting a long time to be struck. "Abigail," he said. "Yes." He looked up. "What we said last night. What we—" He stopped. Started again. "I don't want you to think that the circumstances—" "Ethan!" She leaned forward slightly. I am 32 years old. I have been through more in the past 4 months than most people manage in a decade. I am not a woman who mistakes circumstances for feelings. She held his gaze. What I said last night I meant, and I believe you know that. He held her gaze. I know that. Good, she said. Eat your breakfast. Your ribs need time, and your pride needs practice accepting help. We have a great deal of work to do. He almost smiled. Almost. You are a very direct woman. My father's greatest gift to me, she said. And this time, when the grief crossed her face, it was softer, less like a wound, and more like a scar present permanent, but no longer bleeding. Webb's men cleared the fallen cottonwood by mid-morning. Carver and his son arrived at 2 and were on the south barn roof by 3. Abigail brought them coffee and did not make a performance of gratitude, which Ethan noticed because it was exactly the right instinct. These were men who would have been uncomfortable with excessive thanks and comfortable with strong coffee and being left to work. She understood that without being told. By evening, the barn roof had been assessed, 2 of the worst sections shored up temporarily, and a plan made for proper repairs when the weather allowed. Carver clasped Ethan's hand at the gate, and his son nodded to Abigail with the respectful directness of a young man who had been raised by a father worth being raised by, and they went home in the early dark. Ethan stood at the gate and watched them go. 3 months ago, he said when Abigail came to stand beside him, Webb would not have met my eyes in town. 3 months ago, you were alone, she said. People make different calculations about a lone man than they make about a man with someone beside him. Is that all it is? No, she said. It's also that you've shown this valley who you are over and over for years. You've just been too isolated for most of them to see it clearly. She paused. Sometimes people need permission to do the right thing. A visible example of courage can be that permission. He looked at her. You're talking about yourself. I'm talking about both of us, she said. They went inside. The letter from Hargrove arrived 4 days later, and it was not the letter either of them had been expecting. Abigail read it at the kitchen table, while Ethan stood at the window, and the quality of her silence told him before she spoke that the contents were significant. Not bad necessarily, but large. The Federal Examiner in Helena, she said. His name is Alderton. He's been building a case for 2 years. Land fraud, false documentation, coordinated manipulation of county records. Not just here, 3 counties. She looked up. Ethan, Crane is not the architect of this. He's one of several managers being used by a network of investors based in Billings and Chicago who have been systematically identifying struggling ranches, placing men in positions of trust, and executing transfers when the timing was right. The silence stretched. My father, she said. Her voice was controlled, but barely. He wasn't a random target. They chose him specifically, because of the water rights on the North Pasture, because of the railroad survey that passed near the eastern boundary 2 years ago. The land was worth considerably more than anyone local understood. She set the letter down. They killed him for railroad land rights. Abigail, Hargrove says Alderton cannot confirm the cause of death without exhumation and examination. She said the word flatly, like someone picking up something sharp and holding it carefully. He says there is circumstantial evidence suggesting my father's decline was accelerated. He says there were medical visits in the final months that don't align with what the attending physician reported. Ethan crossed the room and sat down across from her. She was looking at the letter, not at him. He was not a sick man, she said. He had always been strong. The decline was fast, faster than it should have been. She pressed her lips together. I told myself it was grief. After my mother died, I told myself grief had done it. Grief can take a strong person quickly. A pause. I wanted that to be true. Wanting it to be true doesn't make you wrong, Ethan said. No, she said. But I think I knew. I think I knew somewhere, and I chose not to look directly at it, because looking at it directly would mean accepting that someone who sat at our table and ate our food had... She stopped. Ethan reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She looked down at his hand, then up at him. "We are going to take this apart," he said. "Every piece of it. Crane, Blackwood, the network and Billings, all of it. We are going to make it public, and we are going to make it accountable. Do you hear me?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I hear you." "Good," he said. "Now tell me what Hargrove needs." The coordination with Alderton required secrecy of a kind that changed the texture of daily life at the ranch in ways that were subtle but constant. Correspondence went out through Webb's property rather than the Silver Creek post office. Meetings with Hargrove happened at the Carver Ranch rather than the Walker place because Hargrove had confirmed that Crane's man watched the Walker Road. Abigail began maintaining 2 sets of records, one that was deliberately findable and contained nothing sensitive, and one that lived in a locked box under the floorboards in the bedroom that had been empty before she arrived. It was exhausting work. Not physically, though the ranch itself never stopped demanding physical labor, but in the sustained cognitive and emotional effort of fighting a battle on multiple fronts simultaneously, while maintaining the appearance of ordinary life. There were nights when Ethan heard her moving in the house, long after she should have been asleep, and he understood without asking that she was working at the table in the dark, and he got up and made coffee and brought it to her without comment, and she accepted it without comment, and they worked in the lamplight together, until the numbers or the letters or whatever she was doing resolved into something she was satisfied with. One of those nights, somewhere in the gray middle of March, she looked up from the table and said, "Tell me something that has nothing to do with any of this." He thought for a moment. "The first horse I ever trained," he said. "Her name was Eleanor. My father named her that, and I spent 2 years trying to convince her the name suited her. She had opinions about everything, including the name." Abigail almost laughed. He felt the warmth of that in his chest. "My father named all his horses after presidents," she said, "which meant we had a Monroe who was terrified of water and a Jefferson who could not be trusted with the gate latch. Jefferson got out. Every Tuesday for 3 years. We never understood why specifically Tuesday." He did laugh then, carefully, because the ribs were still tender. And she laughed with him. And it was the realest sound he had heard in the house since the night her father's letter arrived. "Ethan," she said when the laughter had settled. "Yes." She looked at the table between them. "Whatever happens with the case, however this ends, I want you to know that this—" She gestured a small movement that included the table, the house, the lamp, both of them. "This is the most I have felt at home anywhere since my father died. I want you to know that." He was quiet for a moment. "This is the most I have felt at home anywhere in 13 years, he said. She looked at him. "Since before the accident," he said. "Since before—" He stopped. He did not talk about the accident. He had not talked about it since it happened. "I stopped expecting this," he said. "I made my peace with not having it. And then your father sent you here in the rain and I—" He stopped again. "Ethan," she said softly. "I'm glad he did," he said. "I want you to know that, whatever else, I'm glad he did." She reached out and touched his face, just briefly. Her hand against his scarred cheek, the scar he had carried for 13 years, the scar that had defined how the world looked at him and how he had learned to look back. She touched it the way you touch something you are not afraid of, like it was just part of him, like it did not require anything from her except the simple acknowledgement that it was there. He went very still. She lowered her hand. "Get some sleep," she said quietly. "I'll be up soon." He went upstairs. He lay in the dark. He put his forearm across his eyes and breathed through the cracked ribs, and through something else that was considerably harder to breathe through. And he thought about a dying man who had written a letter in his final hours not to explain himself, not to defend his choices, but to try to give 2 people he loved something they had both stopped believing they deserved. Sleep came eventually. It came easily, in a way that it had not in a very long time. The break in the case came on a Friday. Hargrove arrived at the Carver Ranch mid-morning with Alderton himself, a quiet, angular man with the permanent watchfulness Hargrove had mentioned, who shook Ethan's hand, and then Abigail's, and then opened his satchel and began laying documents on the table with the careful precision of a man presenting evidence he has spent 2 years assembling. 3 weeks ago, Alderton said, a ranch manager in Custer County named Whitfield made a decision. He had been part of the network for 4 years. He had also in that time developed a conscience that he found increasingly inconvenient. He placed a document at the center of the table. He came to my office. He brought records. He named names, including Crane, including Margaret Blackwood, who has been a financial backer of the network's operations in this county for at least 3 years. He looked at Abigail, including the name of the physician who attended your father in his final weeks. The room was absolutely silent. Abigail did not move for a long moment. Then she said, "What did the physician do?" Alderton met her gaze steadily. He altered his reports. We believe he also... A pause. The careful pause of a man who understands the weight of what he is saying. We believe he administered something. We cannot confirm the full extent without further investigation, but Whitfield's testimony provides a foundation for that investigation. And Crane, Ethan said. Crane will be served with a federal warrant within the week, Alderton said. The county officials who assisted in recording the fraudulent transfers are already under examination. The Billings investors are aware that something is moving. We have kept this as contained as possible, but men like that have networks of their own, and they have begun to feel the pressure. He looked at Abigail. Mrs. Walker, everything you have documented, every record you have kept, every letter you have written to the county clerk, all of it is now part of a federal evidentiary record. You built a case from inside a storm, while people with considerably more resources were working to discredit and frighten you. That matters. Substantially. Abigail's hands were flat on the table. She was looking at the documents. When does it go to court? The federal grand jury convenes in 6 weeks, Alderton said. Your testimony will be central. Hargrove will prepare you. But I want to be plain with you today about what you are going to face. Crane's attorneys will attempt to construct an alternative narrative. The investors will spend considerable money on their defense, and some of what will be said about you and your father in that courtroom will be difficult to hear. I know that, she said. I want to be sure you're prepared for it. She looked at Alderton steadily. Mr. Alderton, I watched my father die. I lost my home. I came here in the rain with 1 suitcase and a letter from a dead man. I have been threatened, lied about, had men sent to burn my barn, and had a tree nearly kill me. She paused. I think I can manage a courtroom. Alderton looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Ethan. Then he said simply, Yes, I believe you can. 2 days after the meeting at the Carver Ranch, Margaret Blackwood left Silver Creek. She did not announce her departure. She did not hold a farewell gathering or send notices to the families who had attended her dinners. She simply closed her house, loaded a significant quantity of her personal possessions, and was gone by Thursday morning. The housekeeper she had employed for 11 years was reportedly given 2 weeks' wages and no explanation. By Friday, the town knew, and the knowledge of it moved through Silver Creek with the particular velocity that significant information moves in small communities, fast, thorough, and not entirely without a quality of collective relief. Because Margaret Blackwood's departure meant that the protection she had provided to certain arrangements and certain men was withdrawn, and people who had been cautious about speaking began carefully at first, and then with increasing directness to speak. Clara Holt said what she said to every customer who came through her store that day. I heard the Blackwood woman left. And then she said nothing else, but the way she said it communicated everything. Ethan heard about it when he rode into town for supplies. He was in Halliwell's feed store when Pruitt came in, the same man who had confronted him outside this very store 2 months ago with Crane's implied suggestions about Abigail's character, and Pruitt stopped when he saw Ethan, and for a moment the two men looked at each other. Then Pruitt said, Walker, and nodded, a different kind of nod than the one he had given 2 months ago. The kind that acknowledges something without using words for it. Ethan nodded back. Pruitt. That was all. But it was enough. He told Abigail about it that evening. She listened and was quiet for a moment, and then said, The ground is shifting. Yes. They can feel it. The people who look the other way because they were afraid, they're starting to calculate whether the fear is still worth the cost. She looked at him. That's what Alderton meant when he said our documentation mattered. Every letter I sent to the county clerk, every record I kept, it's not just evidence for the federal case. It told this town that I wasn't going away, that we weren't going away. And people respond to persistence in a way they don't respond to outrage. Outrage burns out. Persistence is credible. Your father taught you that. He taught me many things. She paused. But that specific lesson I learned from watching you. He looked at her. You have been on this ranch alone, pushing through the rejection and the isolation and the practical difficulty of running a place by yourself for 13 years. She said, you never left. You never stopped. You just kept going. She held his gaze. That kind of persistence is a form of integrity. It tells the world that you are not a man to be outworn. I watched that and I took notes. He did not know what to say to that. He sat with it for a moment in the particular way that a person sits with something true that they have not heard before. Then he said, I want to say something. She waited. When you are done fighting this case, he said slowly, when Crane is in custody and the fraud is public and your father's name is cleared and whatever else has to happen has happened, I want you to know that this is your home, not temporarily, not as an arrangement, your home. He looked at his hands, looked up. If that's what you want, I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I wanted you to know that the offer is permanent. She was looking at him with an expression he had never seen from her before. Something open and unguarded that she was not trying to manage into something more composed. It's what I want, she said. It has been for some time. He let out a breath he had apparently been holding without noticing. All right then, he said. All right, she said. Outside, the March wind was finally giving way to something that suggested distantly the approach of spring. The cold was still there, but it had changed character, slightly less punishing, more provisional. The kind of cold that knows it is losing. Ethan looked across the table at the woman his friend had trusted him with, the woman who had arrived in the rain with one suitcase and a letter, and had proceeded over the course of a Montana winter to rebuild his fences and his accounts and his understanding of what his life could contain. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has stopped being afraid to want. She looked back at him the same way. The grand jury is in 6 weeks, she said. We should go over the documentation again this week. Make sure everything is in the order Hargrove needs. Tomorrow, he said. Tonight we can just be here. She considered him. Then she said, yes, all right. And something in her settled, some braced-held thing that had been held for a very long time. Tonight we can just be here. They sat together into the lamplight while the season shifted imperceptibly outside, and neither of them said anything more for a while, and the silence was the best kind, the kind that does not need filling, because everything that matters is already present inside it. On the wall, the clock ticked toward 10. Somewhere outside, Webb's cattle moved in the dark, and in Silver Creek, in the office above the bank where Gerald Crane had been conducting his business for the better part of a decade, a man sat alone and knew with the particular certainty of a man who has spent years reading the direction of power that the ground beneath him had finally irrevocably begun to give way. He had underestimated Samuel Harper's daughter. He had underestimated the scarred cowboy she had married. And in 6 weeks in a federal courtroom in Billings, Montana, with a cattle rancher's meticulous records, and a federal examiner's 2 years of assembled evidence, and a ranch manager turned witness. Sitting in the gallery, he was going to understand completely, and finally exactly, how much those 2 miscalculations had cost him. The morning they left for Billings, Webb came to see them off. He arrived before first light, which was not something Ethan had expected, and he brought 2 of his men with him, which was also not something Ethan had expected. They stood at the gate in the cold April dark, and Webb looked at Ethan and said, Carver's boys will check your property every day while you're gone. I'll ride the fence line myself on Wednesday. He paused. You come back with what you went for. Ethan looked at him. I intend to. Webb nodded. Then he looked at Abigail. He took his hat off, which was a gesture that meant something from a man like Webb, and he said, "Your father was a good man, Mrs. Walker. This valley owed him better than it gave him. I'm sorry it took this long for the right people to understand that." Abigail looked at Webb for a moment, with an expression that held everything she had been carrying since October, the grief, the fury, the exhaustion, and underneath all of it, the thing that had kept her moving through all of it. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Webb. That means a great deal." Webb put his hat back on, stepped back, and that was that. Ethan helped Abigail up into the wagon and climbed up beside her and took the reins, and they went down the road in the early dark toward the stage that would carry them to Billings, and neither of them looked back. Not because the ranch didn't matter, because it mattered enough to fight for, and fighting for something means moving toward it, not standing still. The stage took 2 days. They spent the first night at a roadhouse outside of Broadview, in a room with a single window that looked out over the flat plains going dark in every direction. Abigail sat on the edge of the bed going through her documentation one more time, with the lamp pulled close, and Ethan watched her work, and thought about what Hargrove had said 3 days ago, when he had come to the ranch to prepare them. Hargrove had sat them both down at the kitchen table, and said in the tone of a man who considers it his professional obligation to remove all comfortable illusions before a trial. Crane's attorneys are Theodore Marsh and a man named Cavell from Chicago. Marsh is capable and experienced. Cavell is better than that. He is the kind of attorney who understands that a trial is a story, and that the story that feels truest to the jury is not always the story with the most evidence behind it. He will attempt to make Abigail the villain of this narrative. He will use her intelligence against her, suggest she is calculated. He will use her composure against her, suggest she is cold. He will use the speed of the marriage against her, suggest it was engineered. "Let him try," Abigail had said flatly. "I intend to let him try," Hargrove said. "And then I intend to present 12 men with 2 years of Alderton's federal evidence, a turned witness, your father's ledger, and every piece of documentation you have gathered since October. But you need to understand what you are walking into." "I understand," she said. "Ethan." Hargrove looked at him. "You will be asked to testify about the arrangement, about the marriage. Cavell will attempt to make you look either foolish or complicit. He will suggest that a man in your position—" He paused. "He will use your history in this community. The scar," Ethan said. "Your isolation, your reputation." Hargrove's voice was careful but direct. "He will try to suggest that a lonely, isolated man was easy to manipulate by a woman with an agenda. That you were used." The kitchen had gone very quiet. Ethan looked at Hargrove for a moment. Then he said, "Let him make that argument. Let him make it in front of 12 men who have met Abigail Walker, and then tell me which story they believe." Hargrove had looked at him for a long moment, and then said, "All right, good." Now in the roadhouse room outside Broadview, Ethan watched Abigail close the ledger and set it on top of the organized stack of documents she had been maintaining since November. She looked at the stack for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Are you afraid?" she said. "No," he said. Then more honestly, "A little." "Me too," she said. "Not about losing. I don't believe we're going to lose. I'm afraid about what I'm going to hear about my father, things they'll say about him, things they'll use against him to make the fraud look legitimate." She pressed her hand flat against the top of the ledger. "He kept perfect records. Everything in this book is exactly what it was, because he was exactly what he was, a man who kept faith with the truth, even in small things. They're going to try to make that look like something else, and I'm going to have to sit there and listen." "You're not going to sit there alone," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Whatever they say, whatever Cavell builds, you're going to be sitting beside me, and I'm going to be right there." He held her gaze. "That is not nothing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No, it's not nothing." She reached across and took his hand. "It's everything, actually." He held her hand in the dark roadhouse room while the plains wind moved outside, and he understood with a completeness that he had never experienced before what it meant to be necessary to another person, not useful, not convenient, but necessary. In the way that certain things become necessary once you have had them long enough that you can no longer clearly recall the shape of life without them. He had been alone for 13 years. He had not understood until he was no longer alone how much of himself had been simply waiting. The federal courthouse in Billings was a building designed to communicate the authority of the law through its proportions, and it succeeded. Ethan had been in courtrooms before on minor business, but nothing that had prepared him for the quality of attention that filled this particular room on the morning the trial opened. The press, the gallery full of people from 3 counties. Alderton's federal colleagues arranged along one side of the room, and at the defense table, Gerald Crane. Ethan had not seen Crane in person before. He had imagined him from Abigail's descriptions, from the shape of what the man had done, as someone visibly predatory. What he saw instead was an ordinary-looking man in his 50s, with a well-cut suit and the practiced expression of someone accustomed to being believed. He sat with his attorneys, and he looked at the room with the calm of a man who had not yet stopped believing he could win. Then he looked at Abigail. She was looking directly back at him. She did not look away. She did not perform anything for his benefit. No fury, no contempt, no satisfaction. Just a clear, steady regard that said plainly and without decoration, "I see exactly what you are, and I have brought every piece of it into this room." Crane looked away first. Ethan noticed that. He believed Hargrove noticed it too. The opening arguments took most of the first morning. Hargrove was precise and methodical, laying the federal case with the same care with which a man builds a structure he intends to stand in, whether every piece placed with deliberate attention to what it would be required to support. Cavell, as promised, was something different. He was a performer in the best sense, compelling, warm, seemingly reasonable, and he built his opening story around a central image of Gerald Crane as a loyal employee, betrayed by the ambitions of a calculating woman who had arrived conveniently in the household of a very wealthy man just before that man's death. In the gallery, Ethan heard a few sounds of agreement. Not many, but a few. Abigail did not react. She sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her, and her posture straight and her expression composed, and Ethan, seated directly behind her in the front gallery row, watched the back of her neck and the set of her shoulders, and thought, "She is the strongest person I have ever known." Alderton testified on the second day. He was on the stand for 4 hours. He walked through the federal investigation with the meticulous thoroughness of a man who had been waiting 2 years for this specific room and was not going to waste it. The pattern of transfers across 3 counties. The methodology so consistent across different ranches, different managers, different counties that it bore the unmistakable signature of a coordinated system rather than individual opportunism. The investment group in Billings and the network connections extending to Chicago. The financial trail. When Cavell cross-examined him, he attempted 3 separate lines of attack. Alderton answered each one with the same unhurried precision, citing documents, citing dates, returning always to the evidentiary record. By the end of the cross-examination, Cavell's rhythm had been broken. He sat down looking like a man who has walked into a room expecting furniture and found stone walls. In the gallery, Ethan heard the shift. The quality of the attention in the room changed. When you have spent a lifetime reading rooms as a man who has to, because he cannot rely on warmth to do the reading for him, you develop a sensitivity to the moment when a collective judgment begins to settle into a direction. He felt it happen during Alderton's testimony. He felt it the way you feel a current in a river change. He leaned forward slightly and said very quietly near Abigail's ear, "The room is with us." She did not turn around, but he saw her shoulders change, a very small release, something held for months, letting go by a fraction. The turned witness Whitfield testified on the 3rd day. He was a lean, weathered man in his early 40s who walked to the stand with the gait of someone carrying something heavy, and was relieved to finally be setting it down. He told his story without embellishment. He named Crane. He named the Billings investors 3 names that produced a stir in the gallery, because 2 of them were known in this territory, known and respected. And the knowledge that they were named in federal testimony restructured something in the room's understanding of how far this had reached. He named Blackwood, and then in answer to a quiet question from Hargrove, he said what he knew about Samuel Harper. The room went absolutely still. It was not a complete account. It was not a confession of certain murder. The law required more than Whitfield could provide for that charge. But it was enough. It was the name of the physician. It was the description of a conversation Whitfield had overheard in the back office of a Billings investment house between men who had discussed the expected timeline of Samuel Harper's decline with a specificity that had nothing to do with natural illness. It was the statement given under oath that Gerald Crane had said in Whitfield's presence that the Harper situation would resolve itself within the season. Abigail's hands were flat on the table in front of her. Ethan could see them from his seat. They did not shake. They pressed down firmly against the wood as if she needed to feel something solid. He wished he could reach through the railing. He wished he could take her hand the way he had taken it in the kitchen in January, in the roadhouse 2 nights ago, a dozen times, in the month since a dying man's letter had brought her to his door. He sat 3 feet behind her and could not touch her. And it was one of the more difficult things he had experienced in a life that had not been short on difficulty. Cavell's cross-examination of Whitfield was aggressive, and by the end of it, visibly unsuccessful. Whitfield was not a polished witness. He stumbled occasionally, corrected himself, occasionally lost his thread. But the core of what he said remained consistent, and consistency under aggressive cross-examination carries its own weight with a jury. When Whitfield stepped down, Hargrove called Abigail. She walked to the stand the way she had walked out to meet Crane's messenger in December, and out to the gate to face Margaret Blackwood in March, with the upright, unhurried carriage of a woman who has decided that the people attempting to diminish her are going to have to work considerably harder than they have planned. She sat. She looked at Hargrove. She was ready. Hargrove took her through it carefully. The death, the documents, the conversation with the deputy, the ride to Ethan's ranch, the ledger, the pattern she had found in the numbers and what it meant and how she had verified it. She answered every question in plain direct language without reaching for sympathy or performing distress, and the plainness of it was more devastating than performance would have been, because it was clearly the account of someone telling the truth. Then Cavell stood up. He went after her for 1 hour and 40 minutes. He was skilled, and he was relentless, and he tried every approach he had. Her composure suggesting calculation, the marriage suggesting opportunism, her accounting knowledge suggesting premeditation, her presence at her father's deathbed suggesting something darker. He circled and returned and circled again, and Abigail met every approach with the same steady precision she had brought to the ledger, to the county clerk's correspondence, to every piece of this fight since the beginning. At one point, Cavell said with a theatrical quality that told Ethan he was performing for the jury. Now, rather than genuinely questioning, "Isn't it true, Mrs. Walker, that your marriage to Ethan Walker, a man known in this community primarily for his isolation and his, shall we say, limited social standing, was a calculated arrangement designed to provide you legal cover while you pursued this claim?" Abigail looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "My husband is the most honorable man I have ever known. He opened his home to a woman with nothing because a dying man asked him to, and he asked for nothing in return. He stood beside me through every threat and every piece of this case without once suggesting that the cost was too high." She paused. "If that is what you mean by limited social standing, then I would suggest the limitation is in your definition, not in him." The gallery was quiet for a beat. Then it was not quiet. The judge called for order. Cavell sat down. He had no further questions. Ethan in the front row of the gallery looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up at the ceiling. Then he looked at the back of Abigail's head as she returned to her seat, and when she sat down and turned slightly, and their eyes met, he did not look away. Neither did she. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. They came back on a Thursday afternoon, with rain beginning outside the courthouse windows, and the foreman stood and read the verdict with the gravity of a man who understood that what he was saying would be heard for a long time. Gerald Crane. Guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, falsification of public records, criminal conspiracy in the acceleration of a death. The language of that last charge landed in the courtroom like something dropped from a great height, and the sound it made was the sound of a room full of people understanding simultaneously that what they had believed was a land dispute was something considerably darker, and that the system they lived inside had been used against them, and that two people from Silver Creek had spent a Montana winter and a federal courtroom taking it apart piece by piece until it could not stand. Abigail did not make a sound. She sat completely still, and then she put her face in her hands, and her shoulders shook once sharply, like something that had been held against enormous pressure finally releasing. Ethan put his hand on her shoulder. She reached up and covered his hand with hers and held it. They stayed like that while the courtroom moved around them. Hargrove leaned across and said, "The Billings investors will be charged separately. The physician's license has already been suspended pending criminal investigation. The county clerk's office will be under federal oversight for the foreseeable future." He looked at Abigail. "The land transfers are void. The Harper property reverts. We'll file the formal documentation next week." She lifted her face from her hands. Her eyes were red. She was the most composed and the most undone he had ever seen her simultaneously, and it was the most honest he had ever seen anyone look. "My father's name," she said. "Will be cleared," Hargrove said. "Completely, publicly. I will personally ensure that the record reflects what kind of man he was and what was done to him." She pressed her lips together and nodded. She did not trust her voice, and she knew it, and she did not pretend otherwise. Ethan squeezed her shoulder. She leaned into it slightly, the way a person leans into something solid when they have been standing in the wind for a very long time. They went home on a Saturday. The same road, the same plains, the same mountains rising in the distance, but everything had the particular quality of a familiar thing seen from a changed position, like a room you have lived in for years, that looks different when you understand finally what it was always meant to be. Webb and Carver were both at the ranch gate when they came up the road. Clara Holt was there too. A handful of others from town that Ethan recognized, and some that he did not. They stood in the late afternoon light, and when the wagon came into the yard, Webb stepped forward and said simply, "We heard." Ethan climbed down and helped Abigail down, and she stood in the yard of the ranch that had become her home, and looked at the people who had come to stand in it with her, and she said, "Thank you, all of you. My father would have—" She stopped, took a breath. He would have been glad to know this valley has the people in it that it does. Clara Holt stepped forward and embraced her without preamble, the way women of that generation and that country embraced each other when words were not sufficient, and Abigail held on. Ethan stood a little apart and watched and felt something that he did not have a precise name for, something that included gratitude and wonder and a quality of grief for the years he had spent believing this was not available to him. The community of it. The simple, enormous fact of not being alone. Webb came to stand beside him. "You done good, Walker." "Abigail did it," Ethan said. "She did," Webb said. "And you stood beside her while she did it. That counts." He looked at him sidelong. "It counts more than you reckon." That evening, after the visitors had gone, after the ranch was settled, and the animals seen to, and the supper made and eaten, they sat beside the fireplace in the front room. Not the kitchen table where they had done most of their living for the past 6 months. The front room where the good chairs were the room that Ethan had not used much before October, because there was little point in sitting in a comfortable room alone. It was full now. Full in the way that rooms become full when the right people are in them. Abigail had her feet tucked under her in the chair, and she was looking at the fire with an expression of exhausted peace, the face of someone who has fought a very long battle and has finally, after all of it, been permitted to stop. Ethan looked at her. He had been building towards something since the roadhouse outside Broadview. Since the kitchen table in January. Since the night of the storm, when a falling tree had clarified something in him that no amount of careful reasoning had managed to clarify before. He had been building toward it the way a man builds toward a thing he is afraid to say, because saying it makes it real, and real things can be lost, and he had lost enough. But they were home, and it was finished, and there was nothing left to wait for. "Abigail," he said. She turned to look at him. "I love you," he said. It came out plainly. Without the elaborate architecture of preparation, he had spent weeks constructing around it. Just the plain fact of it, said out loud for the first time in a firelit room in a ranch house in Silver Creek, Montana, in the spring of 1893. She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said, and then softly, with the small smile he had been watching arrive in pieces since November, "I loved you long before you found the courage to say it." He let out a breath. "How long?" "The morning after the barn fire," she said. "You came back inside covered in soot, and you had beaten out the fire, and you were shaking, and you would not let me see that you were shaking. And I thought—" She looked at the fire. "I thought that is the kind of man my father would have trusted without reservation. And then I thought that is the kind of man I would trust without reservation. And then I understood that the two thoughts were not separate things." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not an easy man to be married to," he said. "No," she agreed. "You're stubborn, and you communicate primarily through action, and you would sooner walk through a burning barn than ask for help." "That's accurate." "I'm not particularly easy either," she said. "I have opinions about everything. I keep records obsessively. I am apparently capable of taking on a federal fraud case while running a cattle ranch in winter." "That last one is a quality," he said. "Yes?" she said. "I thought you might see it that way." He reached out and took her hand. She gave it. They sat together in the firelight while the spring night settled outside, and the ranch breathed around them. And somewhere in the south pasture, a horse moved in the dark, and the fence lines were repaired, and the books were balanced, and the garden would be planted next week, and there was nothing pressing, and nothing threatening, and nothing left that needed to be endured. Only this, only what they had built. The months that followed wrote themselves in the language of ordinary life, made extraordinary by what it had cost to arrive at it. The Harper land was formally restored in May, the legal transfer completed with Hargrove present, and the county clerk a new one the previous, having been removed under federal oversight, signing his name to documents that undid what had been done in malice and restored what had been taken in theft. Abigail stood in the county office and watched the clerk's pen move across the page and did not make a sound. But Ethan, standing beside her, felt her hand tighten in his, with a pressure that said everything words would have failed to contain. The physician who had attended Samuel Harper in his final months surrendered his medical license in June and faced criminal charges that the federal prosecutor described in public as among the most serious violations of professional trust he had encountered in 20 years of practice. The Billings investors settled with the federal government in a negotiated agreement that cost them considerably more than they had gained. One of the named men, the most prominent of the three, a figure known throughout the territory, resigned from his civic positions and did not recover his standing. The others followed with varying degrees of disgrace. Gerald Crane received a sentence of 12 years in federal prison. He heard it read in a Billings courtroom on a Friday in June, without visible expression, which Hargrove told Abigail afterward was the reaction of a man who had spent the entire trial believing in the outcome he was trying to engineer, and had not until that moment fully accepted that it had not worked. When Abigail heard the sentence, she was in the Walker Ranch kitchen. Hargrove had sent a telegram. She read it at the table, folded it, set it down, and sat with her hands flat on the table for a long time. Then she picked up the telegram and went outside to where Ethan was working at the fence. She handed it to him without speaking. He read it, looked at her. "Is it enough?" he said. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "No," she said finally. "It will never be entirely enough. My father is still dead. That doesn't change." She looked out at the fields. "But it is the most that the law can do. And the law did it. That matters." "He would have said the same thing," Ethan said. "I know," she said. "He was very pragmatic about justice. He said the law was imperfect and indispensable in equal measure, and a man who refused to use it because it was imperfect was a fool." She almost smiled. "He said a great many things that I am still working through. He was a smart man." "He was the best man I knew," she said. Until I knew you. Summer came to Silver Creek, the way summer comes to Montana, when the year has been difficult, with a generosity that feels almost like apology. The fields producing beyond expectation. The sky doing the spectacular things it does when the light is long and the air is clear. The whole valley settling into a quality of abundance that people who live by the land understand as something more than agricultural. It is a message. It is the year saying, continue. It is the earth saying, you are still here, and that is enough to build on. The Walker Ranch had its best season in years. Abigail's reorganization of the accounts and the supplier negotiations and the livestock management she had been quietly improving since November produced results that September in numbers that made Ethan stand at the kitchen table and look at the ledger for a long time. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. She was standing beside him looking at the same numbers. "My father's letter did this, and Alderton, and Webb and Carver and Clara Holt." She looked at him. "And you. Mostly you." "I just held the fence," he said. "Ethan," she said. "Holding the fence is everything. That's what the whole winter was. Two people holding the fence." He looked at her. One morning in late August, she came downstairs later than usual. He was already in the kitchen, coffee made the early light coming through the windows, and he turned when he heard her on the stairs, and something in her face stopped him. She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen before, something large and careful, and trying to contain itself. "Sit down," she said. "What's wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She sat across from him, took a breath. "We're going to have a baby," she said. The kitchen was very still. Ethan looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he had stopped believing the world was willing to give him, with a disbelief so complete that it takes a moment for reality to establish itself through it. His face did several things in quick succession that he made no effort to manage, because there was no version of this moment that required management. She reached across the table and took his hand. "Say something," she said softly. He looked at her. He looked at her hand in his. He looked at the kitchen around them, the table, the stove, the window with the summer fields beyond it. The life that had been built here piece by piece through a winter that could have broken both of them and had instead made them into something that could not be broken. "Samuel," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "If it's a boy." Her eyes filled. "Yes," she said. "Samuel." "And if it's a girl?" She thought for a moment. "Grace," she said. "Because that is what this year has been." He looked at her across the table. He had come home 13 years ago from the accident that had marked his face and marked his life, and had built a wall between himself and everything the world offered. And he had lived inside that wall, and told himself it was protection, and told himself it was enough, and had almost over time believed it. Then a dying man had written a letter, and a woman had come through the rain with one suitcase, and the particular kind of courage that does not announce itself, and everything that the wall had been keeping out had come in anyway. All of it, every bit of it. He brought her hand up and pressed it against his face, his scarred, marked, finally unguarded face, and held it there. She did not pull away. She never had. The greatest thing Samuel Harper had given either of them was not the letter, and not the introduction, and not the dying wish that had sent Abigail down a rainy road to an isolated ranch in Montana in October of 1892. The greatest thing he had given them was the knowledge that they were worth giving something to. That two people who had each decided separately and for different reasons that they were not the kind of people the world made room for, that those two people deserved room. Deserved a table and a fire, and someone to hold the fence beside. And from that knowledge delivered by a dying man who loved them both, they had built the rest themselves. That was how it was done. That was how it had always been done. Not in the grand moments, not in the courtrooms or the storms or the confrontations at the gate, but in the 1,000 ordinary mornings that came after the coffee made, and the fence mended, and the name chosen, and the hand held, and the word spoken at last, in a fire-lit room, to the person who had been waiting longer than either of them had known. Ethan Walker had spent 13 years believing he was a man the world had finished with. Samuel Harper had known better. And Abigail Harper, Abigail Walker, had proved it true in every way that mattered on every day that counted for every year that followed. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was everything.